When entering a restaurant, it's important to ask the hostess to do what you need to do as far as assistance, asking for her elbow, asking for her to let you know if there's anything in your way, steps or hanging objects that you need to be aware of. Also, letting her know to put your hand on the chair so you're in control of where the chair is and you're able to clear the chair, make sure there's nothing on the seat. It's important to remember that you're in charge of from where your shoulders are to the end of your fingertips. So using trailing technique to trail around the tabletop and find out what's in front of you, including your table setting, your knives and forks and spoons, as well as the salt and pepper shakers, sugar bowl, even the menu that may be on the table. So using your fingers to trail around slightly and find what's in front of you, remembering to use spoken communication if needed, ask the waitress what's available on the table that you're not able to find. When trailing around the tabletop, the reason for doing that mostly is to orient you to what is on the table so that you don't accidentally bump something or knock a water glass or a wine glass over. When your food does arrive and it's on the plate, you do the same kind of thing, finding your food on the plate using your knife and your fork. When you pick up the knife and the fork, you use the knife to locate what's on your plate. First, use the fork to rub against the knife and find the sharp side down, and then you use your knife and fork to locate the food that's on the plate. After you've done that, it's a good idea to use the backup technique, which is where you use the knife and you kind of use it as a wall to prevent anything from falling off the plate and onto the table. So the knife is backing up everything so it prevents falling off the plate. And then you use the fork kind of to scoop into the backup wall and then to your mouth. When you are locating and eating the food on the main plate, it's always important to have two utensils. Mostly, one is used to give you a reference point. Like I said, the backup technique, the knife is used as a wall to sort of protect food from falling off. Also, when you're using a spearing technique where you're using the fork to poke into food, the knife is used to judge how much food is actually on the fork. So when you spear into the food, then you use the knife to check out the size of what you put on the fork before you place it into your mouth. Because sometimes you spear into it and you have way too much or actually not anything at all on the fork. So the knife acts as a method of knowing, a tactile method of knowing exactly what's on the fork before bringing it to your mouth and prevent spilling all over the place again. When cutting a meat substance on your plate, you use both. Again, you use the knife and fork again. When you're anchoring the meat, you use your less dominant hand to anchor with the fork, and then you use the knife to cut. You judge the size based on where the fork is and using the knife to feel around the size of the meat. And then you use the fork to anchor it and the knife to cut into the meat. And one of the things that is important to listen for is that you hear the plate with the knife, so you know that you've actually got through the meat to the plate, so you know you've got all the way through. After you put the fork in and you cut into the meat, using your fork and your knife to judge the size of the piece that you've cut, so that it's a bite-sized piece, not a great big old piece. And feeling around with the knife helps you know how big the piece is before you're lifting it up to your mouth. When you're cutting meat with a steak knife, it's important again to use the knife in your stronger hand. In my case, it was the right hand. And using your left hand to anchor, your less dominant hand to anchor. Cutting with a steak knife is the same, cutting into the meat. Once you hear the knife hit the plate, then you know you've got all the way through it. You can use the knife and the fork to cut the meat away from a bone. If you have meat with a bone in it, you can cut away from the bone, remove the bone, and then cut one piece at a time. And then judging again with the size, with the knife to feel the size of the piece before you put it into your mouth and know that it's a reasonable size. Using your knife and fork as a means of seeing how much food is still on your plate and pushing it to the center after eating 3 or 4 bites, to remember to push to the center of the plate so there isn't things falling off the sides. push to the center, and then start again with your fork and your knife cutting pieces of meat again. It's really important to use these skills every day, practice every time you go someplace, every time you eat at home, not to use it as just something you do when you're out, because if you're not practicing and using it all the time, you won't do it and it won't become second nature. It's important that every time you sit down that you have two utensils, whether it be a knife and a fork for cutting things, or a fork and a spoon for side dishes of vegetables, coleslaw or green beans. It's important to bring the side dish close enough to you on your dominant side that you're able to reach it easily. Again, using two utensils, a fork and a spoon, so you're not sticking your fingers into the food. The spoon is used to push onto the fork. Rather than using your fingers to push onto your fork, you use the spoon to push onto the fork, and then just kind of scoop it onto the fork and then into your mouth rather than using fingers. Again, using the pushing to the center techniques to prevent things from falling out on the sides. For side dishes such as coleslaw, you're able to use the spoon as your dominant utensil, and you can use the fork to push onto the spoon, using two utensils to prevent using your fingers, but it's okay to use the spoon on a side dish such as coleslaw and use the fork as the pusher onto the spoon, remembering to push to the center of the dish so you're not having food falling out on the sides as well. Some vegetables like green beans are speared either on the main dish or in a side dish. It's always important to have another utensil to check the size of what you've speared. Sometimes when you spear into green beans, you get just one or two, and sometimes you get a whole lot. So it's important to either use the spoon as your second utensil on the side dish, or use the knife as the second utensil on your main dish, to check the size of how much is on the fork and judge from the tactile feeling before putting it into your mouth. On a side dish such as broccoli spears, again using two utensils, the knife and the fork, you use the knife to cut in your dominant hand and use the fork to anchor what you're cutting. It's okay to cut the whole thing up and then switch your fork to your dominant hand and use the knife for backup, and use the backup method to get the food to your mouth without spilling. Again, using the push to the center technique to make sure food isn't falling off the sides of the plate. On desserts, it's also important to use two utensils. It can either be the fork or the spoon in the dominant hand. On a piece of cake, you can use either one and have the second utensil be the pusher. You can use the fork to cut into it and the spoon to push onto the fork. Or the other way around, you can use the spoon to eat with and use the fork to push it on. Some desserts, such as fruit pies, apple or cherry pie, it's easier to use the spoon as the dominant utensil and scoop with the spoon, and use the fork as a pusher to push into the spoon and then bring it to your mouth. Again, with desserts, a lot of times the dessert fills up a great part of the plate that it's on, so it's important to check the sides of the plate to make sure you don't have food spilling off the sides. So pushing to the center is important, especially on a little tiny dessert plate. Because there are very few blind people in the world, I feel like it's a really important thing that when I'm out, I don't want to call attention to myself by making a terrible mess when I'm eating. It's important to me that I'm able to go out with my family and my friends and feel comfortable and confident. And the only way that I've reached the point that I am at now is by practicing. And practicing no matter where I am, whether I'm at home or out, it's important for me to know that I'm okay, that I can order my food and I can eat my food successfully and not have to worry about making a mess. It's also important to me to know that I look okay, that people are not going to look across the restaurant and say, oh, look at that poor blind girl, she's making a terrible mess. I know that through the practice and the skills that I have, I can sit in a restaurant and feel just like anybody else, and I don't think that anybody would recognize that I am a person with a visual impairment just merely by looking at me, and certainly not